Hi everyone, Trish Triumpho Sullivan here. And we're going to talk for just a moment about the shutter control on your camera. So the shutter controls how fast, or how long, I should say, how long it takes for the shutter to open and expose your film or your media, which could be your digital media, to light. So remember, there's two main controls on your camera that control exposure. The two main ones are your aperture and your shutter. The third one is your ISO, and we're going to talk about that in another lecture. But for now, I just want to talk about the shutter by itself for just a moment. This is a kind of a quick review. So your shutter, and I'm going to remind you, it's kind of like a curtain. And the curtain can open very quickly or very slowly, right? So the aperture is like a window, and it changes size, right? It can be very small or it can be very large. And if it's small, it only lets in a small amount of light. If it's large, it lets in a large amount of light. Well, the shutter controls light too, except it controls how long the light, the window, your aperture is exposed to light, right? Where your media is exposed to light. So it can open very slowly, 1001, right? Or it can open very quickly, right? So you can, so fast that you can't even see it with your naked eye. And so the shutter control is called, usually they call it the shutter speed. And because we're talking about the speed with which the shutter opens and closes. That's it. It's pretty straightforward. On your shutter, you'll find a lot of different numbers, and the numbers represent how fast the shutter opens. And I think we talked about this in our earlier lecture. If we start with the shutter speed of 1, right, that's 1 second. Everything else is a fraction, right? So we have 1/15 of a second, 1/30 of a second, 1/60 of a second, 1/125 of a second, 1/250 of a second, 1/500 of a second, 1/1000 of a second, 1/2000 of a second, 1/3000 of a second, 1/4000 of a second, right, etc. So some shutter speeds could even be up to 8,000. It's maybe even faster than that. So on the other side of this 1 second, you might also see some controls that will say like 10 seconds or 8 seconds. You might see like this. 30 seconds, 45 seconds, right? And then you'll also probably see a B setting. Most cameras these days have just the bulb setting. And the bulb setting is for long exposures. So that's for, say, if you're trying to take a picture of the moon or something in the dark of night and you needed to have the shutter open for a really long time. This function will keep the shutter open as long as the shutter release button is depressed. What that means is, as long as your finger is holding it down, you have to actively hold it down. A lot of older cameras will also have this on it, and this T is for time. Write that in here. The T stands for time. And this one, it opens the shutter when you press the button. When the shutter release button is pressed. But then the shutter stays open until you press it again. So it closes when the release button is pressed again. So the time will keep it open for a long, long time. So these are like for taking specialty photos, like night shots or something like that, where you have to have the shutter release button, the shutter open for a long time in order for enough light to come in to actually make an exposure. And so to give you some context with this, in order for us to see with our eyes, we need light. Light is like the most important thing for seeing. If we're in a completely dark room where there's no light whatsoever, we literally can't see, right? The same is true with our camera. If we're in a dark situation, our camera can't see. It needs to have enough light collected into it in order for it to see. If we're in a really dark room, but there's a teensy bit of light, our eyes will eventually adjust and we'll be able to see some things, right? We'll be able to see some maybe outlines of things and like that. But that means that there's light there. We have to have light to see. It's a scientific fact. We cannot see without light. So light is the most important thing in photography. Without light, we wouldn't have photography, right? We'd still be in the dark. So, like I said, all these numbers represent how fast the shutter opens. So this would be considered a very slow shutter over here, right? Once you get below 1/30th of a second, it's slow. Because think about it, if you have a 1001, right? That's a long time for the shutter to stay open, and a lot of times you just can't even hold your camera still for a second when it's handheld. You need basically anything below 1/30th of a second, you probably need a tripod. You'll need a tripod to hold your camera still. And I will show you another way to hold your camera still too. We'll talk about that as well. So the shutters, these numbers represent the shutter speed. So we can go down to seconds. There's a bulb setting. Sometimes you might have a time setting as well. But we're pretty much mostly going to be working with this. These are the ones that we're going to do. So this would be a slow shutter speed. And up here, once we get over 500th of a second, these are fast shutter speeds, right? You couldn't see that with your naked eye. There's absolutely no way. So how does this work? So this would be slow, this would be fast. Okay? And that's why they call them shutter speeds, because it's talking about how much time and how fast it goes, how fast it opens and closes. So they are often also called stops. You'll see that stop is interchangeably used very often with the aperture. So you have f-stops and then you have shutter stops. But a lot of times people will just say a stop, right? And that's okay, just so you know why they're, what is that about, right? So let's talk a little bit about how the shutter works, okay? In conjunction, why do we have those two separate controls that control the amount of light coming into the camera? Why do we have an aperture and a shutter speed? Why not just have one thing that just, opens up and then closes up, boom? Because they help you to create photographs and describe two different things. So we talked about the depth of field, and that's aperture. The aperture controls the depth of field, and that's how much of your photograph is in focus. For the shutter, it controls motion. So this is how we control how we describe motion in a still photograph. And let's see how they work together really quickly again. So here's our aperture. Right, and so our aperture also has numbers that represent the size of the aperture. So if we're going to start over here, we'll start with a 1 as well. So this would be the biggest the aperture could be. And then I'll make them numbers that we would normally see on a camera. Actually, let me write these a little differently so I have room for them on this board here. So we'll go F2, F4, F5.6, F8, F11, F16, F22, F32, and F64. Now those are pretty common. You normally are not going to see an F64 unless you're using a box, a view camera, one of those big box cameras. In general, they don't go down that small. That would be the tiniest pinhole that you can't even see it. So let's see how that looks. Okay, we already talked about that this would be a slow shutter speed over here, right? All these ones, up to about here would be slow. And then a fast shutter speed would be on this end. All right, so we got there. And these would be kind of medium. 250 is what I tell you guys to set your camera at for the Sunny 16 rule, right? So the aperture, so this would be like the whole aperture. F2 would be half of that, right? And this would be a fourth of that. And this would be, and so it goes down. To like the tiniest ones. So this represents the size of the window, right? We talked about the aperture being the window. Right? So how do they work together? And this is mostly about the shutter. So we're going to talk about shutter in just a sec. I'm going to grab a different marker color. Okay, we'll see which one works here the best. So if you have something that's moving very fast and you want to freeze motion, you want to use a fast shutter speed, right? If something's holding completely still, like it's inanimate, like a coffee cup or something that's just sitting there, it's not going to get up and run away, then you can use a slow shutter speed, right? And most everything else you can use, in between here, okay? But the shutter speed is specifically used to describe motion. So we're going to talk in our lecture about our assignment number 3. We'll talk about the motion. But I want to just go over this really quick. So we're starting off with a shutter speed of 250 and an aperture of f16. That's our Sunny 16 rule, remember? So that's Sunny 16 rule. I want you guys to memorize this. This is one of the few things that I think is super important for memorization in this class, is the Sunny 16 rule, because it's going to help you with your camera so much, and it just makes learning it much easier. So let's say I'm starting off with a Sunny 16 rule, and that means my ISO is at 200, right? We're starting off there. So Sunny 16, f16, and 2/50th of a second. So let's say I want to photograph, I want to freeze motion on a on my friend that is doing some tricks on their skateboard, right? So it's skateboard tricks. So I want to use a faster shutter speed than 2/50th of a second. So, and it's a nice sunny day out, so I don't have to worry about any switching up from the Sunny 16, any adjustments for that. So I want to freeze motion, so I'm going to move my shutter to 1/1000th of a second, right? So I'm going to move that. Now remember we talked about that theory, or the theory of reciprocity, that reciprocal relationship that the shutter and the aperture have together. And that means if you change one, in order to keep your exposure correct, in other words, to keep a correct exposure like we did on assignment 1, you'll need to change your aperture to compensate, because we're letting in, right, 2 times or 4 times actually less light, right? And so we need to let in more light from the aperture. So in order to do that, we're not going to move it over here where the aperture gets smaller, because that's going to let in less light. We're going to move it over here. We're going to open up the aperture 2 stops to compensate for that 2 stops of less light that I'm putting in for the shutter because I want to freeze motion on my skateboard friend, right? My skateboarding friend. So that is, it's pretty simple. I don't want to make that, I think a lot of times we try to make things harder than they really are. This isn't hard. This is really easy. I think it's confusing a lot of times because of all the numbers and what do they mean. And so for this, I'm going to do a couple little demos here. So let's say we're starting off once again F16 and 250. And once again, it's a bright sunny day, but this time I'm going to take a portrait. And in this case, I want to blur out the background. So in this case, the aperture is kind of important. The shutter speed's not so important because I'm taking a portrait and the person's going to be sitting still, right? They're not going to be running away from me, trying to get away from the portrait, right? They're going to sit still for my portrait, thankfully. So I need to open up my aperture because I want a narrow depth of field, right? In this case, this would be a narrow depth of field, and this would be a very wide depth of field over here, right? So in this case, I want to open up my aperture 1, 2, 3 stops. So I want to get at least to a 5.6, and maybe I want to get to a 4. Maybe I want to do 4 stops, okay? So I'm letting in 1, 2, 3, 4 stops more light. So that means I have to adjust my shutter speed to let in 4 stops less light on this side, on this control. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I want to speed up my shutter so it lets in less light. Make sense? Yeah. It should make sense anyway. So this is how this works. The shutter and the aperture work together to create an exposure. And when you're starting off with this Sunny 16 rule, which is really basic daylight exposure, or BDE. This is our technical term, but most people just call it the Sunny 16 rule because it's so much easier, okay? And this is the way that you can adjust your camera to see like your eye, number one, and also for whatever situation you're photographing. If you're photographing sports, you might want to have a fast shutter speed, right? Because in sports, people are moving around. If you're photographing, a stationary object, like say a flower, it's not really moving, you don't have to have a fast shutter speed, okay? So these, you basically just change when you need to change for speed or aperture size, if you want for depth of field, I mean. So you're either looking at speed with a shutter or depth of field with the aperture, because that's what the aperture is. It does depth of field. Right. So the reciprocal relationship we're talking about really basically just has to do with what you're photographing. Photographing something holding still, right? You can use a slower shutter speed, right? So then we come to this point when we talked about the Sunny 16 rule. What about the weather? Okay, so this is great if you're out in the full sun, but what if you're not out in the full sun? What if it's a cloudy and foggy day? Here in Salinas, we get those a lot. That's what we're having right now, is a nice low clouds and fog morning here. So if you're in a cloudy, foggy condition, the Sunny 16 rule, you'll have to add 3 stops more light. Okay. And what does that mean here? Well, this means in this case you just need 3 stops. That's it. And remember, a stop refers to an F number or a shutter speed that's a whole number, and these are like the whole numbers that you would have. These are full. They're called full stops. Some cameras have half stops and third stops. In other words, you have shutter speeds in between these ones that I've written on the board. Right? There's ones in between, and in some cases they also have apertures that are in between. Right? So those are called half and third stops. And some cameras have them, some don't. So you'll know when you look on your camera if you have any other shutter speeds than the ones I've listed here. Okay? If I have any other ones, that probably means you have half stops and third stops. And those can be useful when you're trying to make really minute adjustments in the lighting. Okay? So these are full stops, and each stop in photography, right, either is 1/2 or 2 times the amount of light, depending on which way you're going. So if I'm making my shutter speed faster, right, I'm cutting the light in half every time. So 1/30th of a second is half the light of 1/15. 1/60th of a second is half the light of 1/30th. 1/125th of a second is half the light of 60th, right? As we go faster, it cuts the light in half. We go the opposite direction, it's times 2, right? It's 2 times the light lit coming in, right? And so the same is true with the aperture. If every whole F number, okay, every whole stop in photography when you're using your aperture is either 1/2 the amount of light, right? 1/2 of 1, 1/4 of 1. So there's 1/2, 1/2 of 1/2 is 1/4, right? And so on down the line until you get to the tiniest little pinhole that you can't even hardly see with your naked eye, right? And the opposite is true this way. If you're going this direction, you're opening up the aperture, you're doubling the light on each of these. And that's why it's easy to make this, with this reciprocal relationship that they have, the aperture and the shutter, it's easy to make adjustments. So we're talking about, we're back to our clouds and fog, right? So we have 3 stops, more light from that Sunny 16 rule where we have our starting point here. So I need to add 3 stops, more light. And this is the beauty of this reciprocal relationship. We can do either or the aperture or the shutter, right? Or we can do a combination of both. So if I want to let in 3 stops more light, I could either slow my shutter down, right? Or I could slow my aperture down. Right, so I could, or not slow it, I'm sorry, I could open it up, 3 stops, 1, 2, 3. And my choice might make a difference in what I'm photographing. If I'm photographing something that's even moving slightly, I probably don't want to move my shutter speed, right? I want to move my aperture those 3 stops. If I'm photographing something that's holding completely still, then it doesn't matter. I could certainly do it there, or I could do a combination of both. So I have 3 stops, I could do 1 stop here and 2 stops there, or 2 stops here and 1 stop there. As long as I have that total of 3 stops, okay? Indoor photography, you're gonna wanna have 4 to 5 stops. More light. Okay, plus 4 to 5 stops. So that same thing is true, right? I can do a combination or I can do both. So I could do 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, boom. And it makes a difference on whether what I'm photographing indoors is moving or not. So that can make a big difference, okay? If it's moving, I may want to just do mostly aperture change, okay? If you're doing a night game or a, like say a night street scene where there's a lot of like lights from street lights and buildings, but it's definitely dark, it's nighttime, you want to have 6 stops more light. night game or a street. Right, so 6 stops more light. So you would put 6 stops more light on if you're outside. So you might want to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 here, and 1 there. Okay, that's our 6 stops. Boom. It's pretty easy, right? So finally, there's one. If you want to do candlelight, like you just have like 1 candle or maybe a birthday cake, would be 10.5 stops, right? And that's for candlelight. Okay. All right, so this is the only time when the ISO might come into play. It's important. Like maybe you are having your grandma's 100th birthday party and you want to get this beautiful night shot of her blowing out the candle on, or probably not 100 candles, but blowing out the candle on her cake. So usually when they're doing that, they darken the room and they bring the cake out. Well, you can't get a photograph of that unless you use your flash. Well, using a flash would ruin it because then you wouldn't see that candle and the glow that's happening. That wouldn't be as dramatic. So you want to know how to do that. So here, I'm going to open up my aperture 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops. And 1, 2, that's 7. Maybe I could get 8 stops out of it if grandma holds really still, right? But then I'm missing like 2 stops. I still can't get, I can't get enough stops to make that work. So that's when you might want to change your ISO. You might want to change your ISO, say, to 800 to get those 2 extra stops. So from 200, you'd go to 400 and then 800. And that would give you the 2 extra stops you need to make a successful photograph in a dark room with just lit by, a candle or 2. So that's it for this time, and we will see you in the next lecture.